open up to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. What we're doing now in this study as we've come to this 11th chapter, just to remind you quickly, we are studying great men and women of faith, heroes of the faith. And in essence, this is what we are studying. Those that God chose to brag on in His Word. This is a divinely inspired letter. And so He's bragging on these men and women of faith here, this heroes of the hall of faith in Hebrews 11. And none stands taller on that list than the man that we know as Abraham. He is the father of the faithful. He stands at the head of the column of the hall of faith. He stands head and shoulders above other great men of faith, and the quality of his faith shines the brightest. It's what we did last week as we begin to look at Abraham from Hebrews 11:8. I said to you that Abraham's life really is a picture, an example in vivid living color about what the Christian life is to be like. And what we looked at last week in the 8th verse of the 11th chapter, let me read it for you. By faith, Abraham obeyed. There's a key word there. By faith, we're highlighting his faith. God's highlighting his faith. And what about his faith? By faith, he obeyed. By faith, he obeyed. When he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. And so what we looked at last week was Abraham going, his going out, meaning that he went out from his family, from those near and dear to him. He went out from his native country, left behind him the land that he knew, the land that he had put down deep roots in, 75 years old when God called him out. He left the home that he had built, a place filled with memories, a place of security and solace, and he left his friends and companions behind, relationships dear to him. But the call of God had come, and he obeyed the call. And what did that obedience look like? Last week, from the 8th verse quickly, it was immediate obedience, meaning this: when the call came, he went. No hesitation, no delay. When the call came, he went. It was costly obedience. All of those things that he had to leave behind him, those associations and familiarities, he had to leave them to step out in faith. And then it was unquestioning obedience. And why unquestioning? Because verse 8 says he didn't know where he was going. He was called to go out to a land of which he knew not, yet he launched out in obedience to God without questioning God. And then fourthly, it was daily obedience. Why daily obedience? Here's why. Because if he didn't know where he was going, what Abraham had to do is he had to continue to look to daily and obey God so that he made sure that he got to where God was leading him. So what we looked at in Abraham's faith last week was his obedient faith seen in his going. Here's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at Abraham's living faith. His living faith. Just like Hebrews 11:8 said, by faith Abraham obeyed. Listen to the opening words of the 9th verse of Hebrews 11. By faith Abraham, he went to live. By faith he went to live. He had a living faith. His faith took him to live somewhere, and he remained there living out that faith. And so let's dive into this continuing story of Abraham and ask God to give us a view of his living faith so that we can learn from his example and emulate that living faith. Verse 9, the first half of verse 9, let's begin there. By faith he went to live in the land of promise as in a foreign land. I want you to notice first here that Abraham lived in the land of promise as a foreigner. Let me just rephrase that a little bit, and I'll give you the first main statement for this morning. I'm going to give you three of them. Here's number one. Abraham lived as a stranger on earth. Abraham lived as a stranger on earth. From that call of God forward, Abraham lived as a stranger on earth. You see, what I want you to notice here is that God had entered into a covenant with Abraham. God had come to Abraham. He had made a covenant with Abraham, gave Abraham a promise, and a part of the promise that God had given to him was a land of promise. That he said to him, Abraham, I am giving you this land as the land of promise. And so Abraham went to the land that God gave him as a promise. Yet how did he live there? It says he lived there, quote, as in a foreign land. You see, Abraham lived in that land without ever actually possessing that land. He lived there as an alien, as a foreigner. Now remember the concept. We're not looking at a history lesson. We're looking at life-changing, life-shaping truth. And here is the connection. Here is a picture in Abraham's life of the Christian life. Just like last week, we are looking at a picture of the Christian life. And the picture of the Christian life here is that our lives are to model our father Abraham, who lived on this earth as a stranger here, as a foreigner in this land. That's how we are to live the Christian life, as aliens, as strangers, as foreigners here. This world is not our home. Paul says in Philippians, in chapter 3, verse 20, he says that our citizenship is in heaven. We're not citizens here. We're foreigners here. We're aliens here. We are living in the world, but we're not to be of the world. And yet, Jesus said this in the Sermon on the Mount. He said, the meek will inherit the what? The earth. The meek will inherit the earth. Just look at the similarity here with Abraham's story. Really a picture of the Christian life. You see, if you're a follower of Jesus, if you've entered into the saving covenant, having been called by God into saving faith in the person of His Son, Jesus Christ, a part of the covenant that you received is an inheritance. And guess what a part of your inheritance is? This earth. It's talking about believers in that statement. The meek shall inherit the earth. Just as Abraham was given a piece of this earth as a land called the promised land to him, we have been given this earth, promised in covenant by God, that He is giving it to us. And what's going to happen on the great and final day when Jesus Christ returns? He is going to take this earth that's been damaged by sin and the fall and rebellion, and He's going to remake it something brand new. He's going to take it and make a new heaven and a new earth. And guess where we are going to dwell with Him? We're going to dwell in that new heaven and earth with Him. And we're going to reign there with Him. This is a land of promise for us. But like Abraham, as we live this life, we are not to live it as residents here. We're to live it as foreigners, as strangers here. Like Abraham, we're to know that it is ours, given by God as an inheritance, but we're not to live like it is ours right now. Because Abraham didn't live like it was his. He lived as in a foreign land. He intentionally lived as in a foreign land. You see, he didn't look like a citizen of that place. He didn't look like a resident, like that was his homeland. Followers of Jesus, we are to look different. We are to look different. Our lives are to look different than the lives of those who are not followers of Christ. We are in the world, but we're not to be of the world. Let me ask and answer two questions related to this. Number one is this: how are we to live as strangers here? And number two, why did God plan it to be like that we would live as strangers here? So first of all, how? How are we to live as strangers here? I'm just going to give you just some bullet point aspects of this. First of all, we're not to see how much we can accumulate here. That's not the goal of life here, to see how much we can accumulate. This is not our home. We are not to treasure the things of this world. We are sojourners, transitory. You don't see how much you can accumulate when you're just passing through. That's not the goal. That's not the purpose. In fact, that becomes baggage and troublesome. We are going to a place that's our home, and our emphasis needs to be on the home we're going to, not the land we are passing through temporarily. And since we do not live, don't possess this world, it's not to possess us. It's not to possess us. Our heart is not to be set upon the things of this world. We are to see them as transitory, fleeting, passing away, decaying. In fact, what's going to happen? They're going to the fire. Everything is going to the fire. That's the truth of Scripture. And so how are we to use our time here? We're to use our time, and we're to use our talents here, and we're to use our treasures of this earth here as a means by which we can prepare ourselves for the home we're going to. That's where our heart is to be. We're not to base our security on the things of this world. You have to base your security on your possessions, and on your wealth, and in your prosperity. Ultimately, those things have no security to them. You may feel like they do, and at times they may provide for you for a period of time or a number of years, but here's what you can be certain about related to those things, that they are all decaying and passing away, every one of them. There is no ultimate security there. And your family and your friends, there's no ultimate security there. They're here, but for a short time, like a mist that is here and then vanishes. And some of you here, if you've lived very long and you've experienced that loss, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Painfully so. Your abilities and your strength and your position, there's no security in those things. What you need to know about beauty is that it always fades. And what you need to know about strength is that it always fails. Always. There's no ultimate security there. You see, all of those things, all of the things of this world, the writer of Hebrews in the 12th chapter uses this eloquent description around verses 27, 28, and 29. He talks about these things of the world and says that they're going to be shaken. What he means by that, what he describes that as, is it means that they're going to be taken away. They're going to pass away. They're going to be shaken out of existence. But what we have is a citizenship that cannot be shaken, an inheritance that cannot be taken away, will never be moved. So some ways on how we're to live here. Secondly, why are we to live like that? Why did God design it to be like that for His sons and daughters living in this land, to be living here as foreigners, as strangers, as aliens? I'm going to give you three aspects, three answers to that question. And number one is this: He did it that way to strengthen our faith. He did it that way to strengthen our faith. Keep your finger there in Hebrews 11. I want you to jump over just a few pages to James chapter 1. James chapter 1. Here's what happens as we live as foreigners in this world. We go through trials. It's a part of living here as sojourners, a part of living here as strangers. It is a life of living in a place where we face trials and tests of our faith. James chapter 1, verses 2 to 4. Let's read that together. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. The trials that come by living in this world as strangers here, as aliens here, what do they produce? Steadfastness. Here's what that means. Another way to say that: faithfulness. They grow your faith. They grow your faith. As you're living here as a stranger, you're living in dependency upon God, and your faith is grown. And what does that faith and those trials ultimately result in? Full spiritual maturity. Listen to it. That you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. That's spiritual maturity. And so here's the way that God's designed it. He wants our faith grown. Oh, God so much wants our faith grown. We looked at the beginning of Hebrews 11. It says this: without faith, it's impossible to please God. Faith pleases God. Faith pleases God. He wants our faith to grow. That pleases Him. And so what He does is He puts us in this place that's going to become our inheritance, but He has us live here as foreigners in a strange land to us, with our home elsewhere, and He allows trials to come along the way so that our faith is strengthened, and so that in dependency we learn to look to Him more and more and grow into full spiritual maturity, and that pleases God more and more and brings Him glory. Because when you live in this world and you set your heart outside of this world unto God and what He has promised to give, what you're doing is you're saying, this is not what I treasure here. What I treasure is there. What I treasure is there. And when you treasure God above all else, that pleases Him. That brings Him glory. And so He lets us go through those trials in order to grow us in spiritual maturity. So it strengthens our faith. Here's the second reason why God, I believe, lets us, or another reason why He lets us live in this world, has us live here as strangers and aliens, and that's to increase our witness. To increase our witness. Think about Abraham's life. Abraham's life became an incredible testimony for God. Abraham was called out and sent to this land of promise that God had given him as an inheritance, and it was a dark place. He was a light in a dark place. He was a life lived in faith to God that looked different than the people around him, intentionally so. And what God did, this is the way God did it with him. He does it, I think, differently with all of his followers. But the point is that God used his life as Abraham walked in faith to be a testimony. And one key way he did that with Abraham is he blessed him. He blessed him. Abraham became fabulously wealthy, even compared to the great wealthy men of his era. Abraham, this traveler living as a stranger in a foreign land, his flocks and his herds and his servants and his possessions incredibly increased. And how did they increase? By the blessing of God. I'll give you one example to highlight that. At one point, a king wanted to give him wealth, and Abraham refused to take it. And his reason was, I don't want it ever to be said that you made me wealthy. God made him wealthy. God blessed him. And his life became this testimony of a man living as a stranger in a foreign place under the waterfall of the blessing of God. And Abraham's God became known through Abraham's life of faith. He was incredibly blessed with wealth. He was incredibly blessed with a bride who, even in her old age, had striking, almost incomparable beauty. He was blessed with children, descendants, multiplied almost beyond calculation. What's God doing? He is blessing a man living in faith, and by that life providing a witness in a dark place. Number three, the reason that God does it that way and lets us live here, has us live here as strangers in a foreign land, is to deepen our longing for home. To deepen our longing for home. He sent Abraham out from his home, took him into a place of which he knew not, and had him live there. And how long did he live there? He was called out at 75. He went to this land and lived there till he died at 175. 100 years he lived there. 100 years. And Abraham, that whole time, we're going to see it a little later in this chapter, what he was longing for was home. Not home back in Ur of the Chaldees that he left, was called out of. He was longing for home. He was longing for the home, the inheritance that God had promised to him. And that sojourning in a foreign land only did what? I believe it caused his appetite, his desire, and his longing for home to heighten, to become more acute. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that's the way God wants it to work for followers of Jesus. He wants, as we live in this life, not to become more and more attached to this world and the things of this world, but to become more and more strangers here, with our hearts attached to what is coming, longing more and more as we get to know God more and more, walk closer with Christ more and more, that the longing in us increases for what is to come. I mean, look at the great Apostle Paul. What he pressed on for was the prize that was coming. And he said that toward the end of his life. As he matured, he is saying, what is life to me is everything over there. Everything over there. Where Christ is seated at the right hand with the Father. That is what I'm living for every day. And to die is gain. Not to accumulate is gain. To die and get there is gain. I think an aspect of the maturing Christian life is a hotter, brighter, more intense longing for the inheritance, the promise, the glory, the joy that is to come. It should be a growing characteristic of the Christian life. And just be careful. It's easy to live like this. It's easy in our humanity to get our focus and our attention on the things right here, to overemphasize the roots here and the things that we acquire here. And what we need to do is learn from an example like Abraham and other great men and women of faith down through biblical history and down through the rest of non-biblical history, on what it means to live with our focus on heaven. And who did that perfectly, church? Who did it perfectly? Jesus did, right? He is the supreme example. And what does it say of Jesus? He only did what he saw his Father doing. Always Jesus was looking forward, looking up, looking to the glory that was coming. That's what enabled him to endure everything in this world for the joy set before him. And so we are to follow Abraham's example here and live with a deepening longing for home. So Abraham lived as a stranger on earth. Second main header. Second aspect of Abraham's living faith, and this will be much quicker. Abraham lived as the spiritual leader of his home, his household, his people. Abraham lived as the spiritual leader of his family. Look at the second part of verse 9. I read, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. That Abraham, as he lived in that land of promise, as a foreigner in that land, he, quote, lived in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. Abraham's faith flourished first and foremost right at home. Abraham's faith flourished first and foremost right at home. Let me show that to you. The phrase here, quote, living in tents, you know what that phrase does? That phrase amplifies and gives commentary on the immediately preceding phrase, which is what? That he's living in the promised land as a foreigner. And the way that he did that is that he lived in tents. The visible manifestation of how Abraham lived in the promised land as a foreigner is that he didn't put down deep roots, he lived transient, he lived in tents. And then look what it says here. So his tent dwelling was synonymous with his alien residency. And then notice that it says his tent dwelling continued through the parenting of Isaac. And his tent dwelling continued through his grandparenting of Jacob. Did you see that? He lived in tents with Isaac, his son, born to him at 100 years old. Lived with him in tents until Abraham died at 175 years old, till Isaac is 75. And with Jacob, his grandson. A little tough to do exact math there from Scripture, but probably around 15, 20 years old before Abraham died is his grandson, Jacob. And notice what it says about them. They lived in tents as well. I think there is an incredible spiritual principle being communicated here. And the principle is this: Abraham's life was influential in his home. Abraham's faith was influential in his home. He lived a vibrant faith. You know, you can, as a follower of Jesus, as one who claims to be a Christian, you can at times do a pretty good job. I can, I'm not pointing a finger at you, but kind of put on a good-looking lifestyle or faith as I rub shoulders with people out in the world kind of from day to day and see them temporarily. But you know where I can't lie? You know where just the truth is known? It's in the home. It's in the home. There is just a pulling back of any kind of attempt to varnish up something to make it look better. And the wife and the children, those that live with you day in and day out, when you're on your best and when you're at your worst, they know whether your faith is a living faith. They know it. They see it. Men, take an example from Abraham here. You are called to live a vibrant faith in your home that influences your children and your wife. You're called to it. It's the plan of God. It's a mantle of responsibility He's given you. Now, I want to qualify that. I don't mean that you can make your kids believe, come to saving faith. I don't mean that. That is a work of God. But God uses godly fathers and godly husbands and godly grandfathers to impact their wives and their children and their grandchildren with the things of God by living a vibrant faith before them. You are called to that. You cannot abdicate that. You can't stand before the throne on the final day and say, but Jesus, I didn't ask for that. And Jesus is going to say, so what? I gave it to you. I'm God, you're not. It was your job. I told you it was your job. I made it clear in the Word. It's your job. Husbands, love your wife as Christ loved the church and gave Himself up for her. And why? To make her holy, washing her with water through the Word, so that she could become spotless and without blemish. A holy bride. You are to be an instrument in the hands of God to help your wife become all that God wants her to be. I don't mean that you can make that happen. You shouldn't try to force that to happen. What you should be is a living, vibrant example of faith that has an influential impact in your wife's life, and you should do that with your children. In other words, your primary responsibility is that. It's not just putting food on the table and providing spiritually. That is secondary. I would say that is a gross secondary reality to the calling that you have as a father and a husband. Your spiritual calling is your primary calling in the home. Live as a son or a daughter of God, as a follower of Jesus. Modeling the lifestyle of Abraham, live as a spiritual leader in your family. So Abraham lived as a stranger on earth. Abraham lived as a spiritual leader in his home. And then number 3, Abraham lived with his focus on heaven. Abraham lived with his focus on heaven. Look at verse 10. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. He was looking forward to the city whose that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. You see, he was looking forward. While Abraham lived here as a foreigner in that promised land, Abraham was looking somewhere else. He lived here as he looked somewhere else. He lived here as a foreigner because he was looking at his homeland that was not there at that moment. We are given, I believe, 3 aspects of Abraham's forward-looking faith here in verse 10. And I want to bring this to a conclusion by showing you these 3 different aspects from the verbiage. First of all, it says that Abraham was looking forward, quote, to the city. To the city. Let's just muse upon that for a moment. Consider it. Why is the description here of the inheritance that is to come for us and for Abraham described as the city? Well, the city, I'll give you 4 or 5 different points here. The city is a place of activity. The city is a place of activity. And in the inheritance that is coming, here's the reality. It's going to be a place of ongoing, endless, glorious enterprise. Let me say that again. Where we are going is going to be a place of ongoing, endless, glorious enterprise. Everything that is done there, everything that we do there and participate in will be highly important and lastingly significant. Highly important and lastingly significant. There's going to be no waste of time there. No insignificant living there. It's a place of perfect activity. There's a God that's going to oversee that in absolute sovereign control, that's going to use us in what He is doing in this universe. And what we do is going to be done in perfection, because we're going to be done with sin. We're going to be done with our own hang-ups and problems, and we're going to be helped powerfully by the Spirit of God as we live in the direct presence of God in His glory, with glorified bodies fit for that habitation and glorified minds fit for that work and glorified skills and understandings that are adept at doing what we do, so that what is done with great skill and results in a highly significant work. And a city is a place of safety, consummate safety. The city that we're going to. Its walls are never going to be breached. You know that? Its residents are never going to be threatened, not one time. Its streets are going to know no crime, period. It is a place of safety. And it's a place of companions. It's full of relationship and interaction and fellowship. There's no loneliness there. There's no isolation there. And some of you say, no, wait a minute. Wait a minute. I like some isolation. I want, and listen, you're preaching to the choir when you say that. That's my sweet spot. You know, the crowd is not my sweet spot. I know that may sound weird to you when you see me up here kind of going off every Sunday, but it's not my sweet spot. It's not where I energize. But here's the difference. I'm convinced that the Lord showed me a difference here on why that is. The reason that we long at times here for isolation and to get away is because we have imperfect companions, and we are an imperfect companion. In fact, sometimes we don't even like to be around ourselves. We can hardly stand ourselves. Amen, brother. But in the city of God, it's going to be a place of perfect companions. And you're going to be one. Everyone that you meet is going to be one. Every single conversation will be a blessing, not a drag. Anybody happy about that? Every relationship is going to infuse life, not suck it right out of you. Is that exciting? And some of you need to know that from the backside, because you're the one that sucks it out, right? Each connection will be an exchange in undiluted, unpolluted, loving interaction that exceeds the connections that we have here, even with the closest of friends. Because our companions there will be perfect, and we will be perfect. And so when we engage with them, we're going to walk away with a greater pop in our step and smile on our face and fullness in our heart. Number 4, because the city is a place of abundance. You know, the coffers are always going to be full there. There will always be an infinite surplus in the budget. You know what's going to be in short supply? No, let me reword that. You know what's going to be in no supply? Needs. No needs. No needs. All needs met. And not only all needs met, every desire fulfilled in a way that you could not even comprehend how great, how thorough, how consummate they will be fulfilled. You see, that's a part of what it means to be looking forward to the city. And then it says, number 2, he was looking forward to a city that has foundations. What's he referring to here? What's the author referring to here? The foundations are unshakable. They remain. They never wear out. They never decay. They'll always be there. You know, this world is full of some incredible foundations. I went and seen some of them in the Holy Lands. Ancient foundations. But you know what? They are in ruins. They are decaying. But the Ancient of Days is going to build these foundations that will always be eternally new. Meaning this, they are unshakable. We are receiving an inheritance that is unshakable. It will always be eternally new, never will be destroyed, never will be moved, never will even be disturbed. They are firmly set foundations. And then number 3, it is a city whose designer and builder is God. Whose designer and builder is God. You see what happens in this world? It's not only possible, it's probable and happens often, is that in the things that we build, you can have a designer that is proficient, but a builder that's incompetent. Or you could have a designer that's incompetent and have a builder that's proficient but can't do anything with the incompetent design. But the reality of where we are going is that the designer and builder are one and the same, and He's the God of infinite perfections. He's a God that is perfect in both of those disciplines and made sure that He Himself designed it and built it so that it will be all and more that we could ever ask or imagine, because eye has not seen, nor ear heard, nor has entered into the mind of man, not ever even conceived of the greatness and the majesty and the reality of where we are going and what it's going to be like. That is our inheritance. That's our inheritance. That's the city that's going to be ours. No wonder if Abraham could see that with eyes of faith, that he lived a life that looked forward to what was coming, not down at the incomparably speaking worthless things, temporal things that are here, so that he would be happy living as a foreigner in a strange land of promise, because he knew that momentary fleeting sojourn was going to turn into a permanent, eternal, joy-filled existence. And if you're a son or a daughter of Abraham, that's yours. That's yours. So do what Abraham did. Live as a stranger on this earth. Men, live as the spiritual leader of your home, passing that on, and then live with your focus on heaven.